All right, everybody ready? Here we go. Welcome to Off Script, NPR's series of conversations with Democratic presidential hopefuls and voters about the issues that matter to them. I'm Lulu Garcia-Navarro, and with us today is Secretary Julián Castro. He is the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Obama, of course, but more pertinently, perhaps, he is the former mayor of San Antonio, Texas, where we find ourselves today. Welcome.
That's right. You can hear the mariachis in the background here. Perfect San Antonio.
I know. We can hear the music. We're wondering if we should actually put in requests. We're at this restaurant, Mi Tierra, and part of the idea behind this is that through the choice of restaurant, we get to know a little bit about you. So why did you choose this restaurant?
Well, Mi Tierra, for those who have visited San Antonio, they may remember it as like the most colorful, jovial restaurant in San Antonio. It's really a favorite of both locals and tourists. And it really represents, I think, a lot of what San Antonio is about. It's Tex-Mex food, first of all, that blending of different cultures with a Mexican influence. Also, the family that started it, really lived the immigrants' American dream story here in South Texas, and they've passed it from one generation to the next. There's an entrepreneurialism there that I think speaks to the spirit of the city. So a lot about San Antonio is reflected in this restaurant.
And you're also on the mural behind us. There is a big mural with many notable figures from San Antonio's history and beyond, many important Latinos. And there is a saying, I understand here, that you will have made it in San Antonio politics once you make it on that mural.
That's right. It reflects, the mural behind us reflects generations of San Antonians, primarily Latinos, who have helped build up the community. It really is a testament to this spirit of community that exists here. For folks who have visited the city, they know it has its own unique vibe, and one of those is a very family-oriented, community-oriented vibe, and that's reflected in that mural.
I did read, and I want to see if it's true, that you took your wife on your first date here. Is that true?
That is true. That was well before I was on the mural, too.
I was about to say.
I was not that arrogant.
It's a good way to convince her.
That's right.
But you did tell
Erica,
her that you were going to be the mayor of San Antonio in that first date.
Did. Well, I said that I was going to run. Yeah, we had our first date here on May 26, 1999. And actually, we just came back a couple of months ago to celebrate 20 years since our first date here at this restaurant.
Yeah. Oh, that's a nice story. I want to introduce our voters who are here to speak with you. We're going to speak with Dani Marrero He. And tell us a little bit about yourself, Dani.
Yeah, my name is Dani. I was born in Reynosa, Mexico. At the age of 7, my family, we moved to Mission, Texas, which is literally right across the river, so I live now like 10 minutes from the hospital I was born in Mexico. I've dedicated myself since I got back from college in 2015 I went back to my community, and I've worked from immigrant rights and also themes on border militarization.
And why are you particularly interested in immigration? We're going to talk about that in a little bit.
Well, as an immigrant myself, right, I understand a lot of aspects about immigration, but I also understand that my story is a lot simpler than so many others. My dad was born in the United States, and so our story was very easy. We were able to cross very easily. But I see so many of my peers and so many people around me that it's not as easy for them. And by just pure virtue that my dad was born here, it seems such a random thing for my immigration story to be so different. And in terms of border militarization, when my family got here in the year 2000, we've seen how radical it has changed in terms of technology and surveillance and the militarization of the border. And so I've grown up with this, and so that's why it's important to me.
And Alston Beinhorn is here with us as well. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Born and raised in San Antonio, went to college in the Northeast, worked as a rancher for a few years, and then migrated to banking, and eventually went overseas with a global bank for 26 years, living in Singapore, London, Toronto, and then now back to San Antonio since about 2013.
And your issue is climate change. This is what you want to
my number one issue.
Talk about today. Tell us briefly why.
I think that the current temperatures and lack of rainfall, which does change over time, but hasn't changed recently, is unsustainable for us and cattle and horses and even our chickens. And I think it's the most pressing issue. It's not, for me, it's not probably the most pressing for many individuals, voters, because it's not happening maybe today or tomorrow, but it's happening for me today. I don't think it's sustainable. And I think this August that we just had here was just despicable with the temperatures. So that is my main issue. And I have others, but that's what
we're going to talk about today. All right. So we're going to start with immigration. Dani, what's your first question for Secretary Castro?
Sure. So like I mentioned, I live in Mission, Texas. And I think for people that don't live on the border, it's hard to envision the negative impact the border wall will have, or even how it looks. You know, in the border in the Rio Grande Valley where I'm from, we see how our community members have to fight for their land. We see how people have protested for years. We see also how people have submitted comments to DHS. And yet Congress still has appropriated billions of dollars for the wall, and DHS has already begun awarding contracts. And sometimes DHS awards contracts even before there's a legitimate consulting process with community members and even with the landowners themselves. But just as these contracts were awarded, they can be canceled by a willing administration. And they can be canceled, and not only that, we can revitalize areas that have been negatively impacted by border barriers. And they can be revitalized from Brownsville, Texas, all the way across, to El Paso, and then to California. We see these border barriers, and communities have been destructively impacted. I would like to know if your administration, for the contracts that have already been awarded, if you all would be willing to cancel them, and if you all would also be willing to restore areas that already have border barriers built.
Thank you very much for the question, Dani. Your experience is one that's shared by a lot of people who live down there on the border and who have a real story to tell that too oftentimes is not reflected in the mainstream coverage of immigration out there. And so I'm happy that we have an opportunity to discuss what's actually happening down there on the border. I've said that I'm completely against building the wall. I don't believe that it's going to be effective. I also object to the taking of land from people who have owned land down there for generations. I object to the way this administration has gone around Congress to move money that should have gone to improve facilities for our troops and active servicemen and women in the United States and around the world, and taken that money and put it to try and build this wall. Your specific question is, what would I do about these contracts? As much as we possibly can, if there are ways for us to put a stop to any of that spending of money, I will. So on January 20th, 2021, I will issue an executive order to put a stop to any kind of spending on building a wall. That's going to be easier than it would be if Congress had actually appropriated resources recently to build a wall. As you know, the president has taken a whole bunch of resources, like I mentioned, from other programs and tried to appropriate it there. If that is not stopped by the courts before the next administration takes over and I'm elected president, I will put a stop to it.
You have been ahead on issues of immigration throughout this campaign, but President Trump has made this a signature issue. If you are chosen as the nominee, how do you bring people together on immigration? Because whereas in 2016, it was not front and center on people's minds, it is now, and opinion is extremely divided on how to be humane, but also secure this country's borders.
Yeah, well, I would say that the president used the issue in 2016 to drum up his base. And he believes that he's going to win by drumming up that base again on this issue of immigration. What's different now is that people actually can see with their own eyes and hear the evidence. I think of the cries of that little girl in the audio tape that we heard about a year and a half ago, crying out for her father. They can see that it's a disaster. So how do we how do we build unity around a different approach on immigration? It begins with the fact that this president has failed. More people are coming to the southern border than were coming before he became president. In our name, he has treated kids and their parents very cruelly. I know a lot of conservatives that don't feel good about themselves for that. They don't feel good about the country for that, even if they still support this president. So what I would do is to move us forward under a common sense approach, and I've laid that out. I was the first candidate to put out an immigration plan that says we can maintain border security but treat people with common sense and compassion instead of cruelty, and put undocumented immigrants who are here on a pathway to citizenship. We can stop the wall that a majority of Americans do not support, and instead do things like invest in a 21st century Marshall Plan for Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala so that people can find safety and opportunity at home instead of having to make the dangerous journey to the United States. We can respect the lands, the ownership of land down there on the border by ranchers who have been there for generations, and also preserve some of these wildlife areas that Donnie is talking about, these environmentally sensitive areas. And we can also do things like create an independent immigration judiciary that has enough judges and support staff to actually cycle through these claims of asylum. So that
When you say independent, so that it's not under
That's
the
right.
auspices of the Justice Department.
Yeah, right now our immigration courts are under the Department of Justice control. And that means they're not like most courts that you deal with that are independent courts. They're basically administrative courts under the executive branch. We need an independent immigration judiciary. I would push for that.
When you talk about securing the borders, I think this brings us to Danny's second question.
Yeah, I want to touch back on something in terms of the conversation on border security and common sense reforms, or common sense, and treating people with compassion. I'm very curious on what that looks like, for you, because I feel that sometimes when we say, we want to treat people with compassion or common sense, it feels like people might want to go back to like the Obama administration. And what we were seeing in the Obama administration, it doesn't make a lot of sense for border communities. When we see local, DPS troopers, when they stop someone for, not putting their tail light or not putting their blinker, and then they call Border Patrol and a family separated, I don't think that's common sense. When we have $800 million being thrown into border security, when there are so many other things that could be invested in throughout the state, and especially in border communities, when we have the National Guard deployed, but they're just kind of sitting there. I've seen them. They're sitting in Border Patrol trucks all day, just staring at the Rio Grande. I don't think that makes sense to me. And those are things that are not new to the Trump administration. They've happened with the Obama administration. And so I want to know, where does this conversation of border security, where does the interests and the wants and the needs of border residents come into play?
It's fundamental to the way that we need to move forward. You're describing DPS troopers, for instance, down there, and the $800 million that has been spent. That's been spent by the Greg Abbott administration here in Texas, the Republican administration. Now, with regard to the governor of Texas, they have put an extra $800 million of Texas money and personnel down on the border, and they have been unwilling or unable to actually explain how effective that has been, because, as Danny describes, it's probably been ineffective. They really haven't been doing anything down there. In terms of the Obama administration, I believe that the Obama administration improved over time with DACA and DAPA, and that perhaps the most instructive thing that the administration did was toward the end of the administration. It did this family case management program that essentially was, instead of detaining families, allowed families to stay together, and oftentimes they have relatives who live in the United States, go and stay with their relatives, in a safe, loving home, and also make sure that they check in for their court appearances. And it had a phenomenal, over 95% success rate of getting people to actually return to their court appearances. I believe that we can do those things. we can also demilitarize our border for the benefit of the people who live down there.
Alston, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, you are a native San Antonian. Obviously, the issue of border security and what happens on the border is pertinent to you too?
Yeah, my livestock raising operation is down on the border near Laredo, so I'm quite involved in it. And my view is the wall is totally unfeasible. It's not going to work. I'm probably one of the few people who've actually flown the border from El Paso all the way down to Boca Chica at 1,000 feet just to look at it, to see how sustainable it would be to build a wall there because of the way the river bends and turns and everything like that. Immigration is a very important issue, and I think for all the reasons that we've been talking about, and for another reason, which is that this country needs more laborers. That we're losing them, and there are people who are getting older and don't want to do the hard work, and we need a program to. It's not a binary equation if someone's a citizen or not a citizen to me. There's a third way, which means that someone can come in on work permits and get a lifestyle that they deserve and want, and go back to maybe their home countries every year or two, and then come back and work more.
So are you saying you wouldn't necessarily like undocumented immigrants to have a path for citizenship, and there should be more of a guest worker program?
I think that would be great. I mean, I think the path to citizenship is not the only solution. I mean, we've done that before. We did that in the 80s. I think we
President
12 million people, and sure enough, here there's another 12 million. So is that what we keep doing? And yes, they're good people, great contributors to society and to their families, and they deserve a great life. But I think in the meantime, we can also have a third way, which is some sort of a visa program for workers, and that's what they want immediately. And I don't know how you feel about that.
So how do you feel? Because you're hearing two sides of the Democratic Party here. Pretty clearly.
No, and I think right now we have elements of both of those, right? We have the ability for people to come and work. We have industries, whether it's agriculture or construction or the hospitality industry, that desperately needs workers right now. They have been hurt by this administration and how they've approached immigration. I also believe, though, that if somebody comes and they give their labor, that should count for something in terms of them actually being able to get on a pathway to citizenship. And so you can have those programs that increase the labor pool. At the same time, I think that ultimately they should have a pathway to citizenship. I also believe...
But to Alston's point, 12 million under President Reagan, and there are an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants here now. For some people, they see this as just a never-ending flow of immigrants who come here without authorization, and that perhaps giving them a pathway to citizenship will encourage them.
I wouldn't say that it's never ending. In fact, you think about 20 years ago, the majority of the people who were coming across the border were single Mexican men. Today, instead, they're people from these Northern Triangle countries in Central America. Well, why has that changed? Part of the reason that's changed is because people can actually find more opportunity in Mexico than they used to. It's still unsafe in different parts of the country, but there is more opportunity there. So if what somebody is interested in is what is the best approach so that 144,000 people are not coming to the southern border, I think the best approach is actually exactly where Trump has failed, which is that you need to work with Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala so that people can find safety and opportunity at home instead of having to make that dangerous journey here. And we will see the numbers of people diminish. At the same time, there's a way for all of us to win here. Let me just connect the dots very quickly as I see it. The Social Security Trust Fund is in danger. It's projected in the next 15 years to be in real danger. You have the biggest cohort of people, baby boomers, who worked and earned their Social Security, who are now turning 65 in rapid numbers and drawing down on that trust fund. At the same time, people have been leaving the workforce, and we had the lowest birth rate in about 30 years last year. What that adds up to is an aging population in the United States without a young, healthy, vibrant workforce to replenish it. We've seen what happens in nations like Japan,
And you're saying immigration is the answer to that?
Immigration is one part of the answer to that, yeah. And
Does
in
that
a
convince you?
combination.
No, I'm all for immigration. I'm just saying that we seem to be stuck on a path to citizenship, and let's do that to me. But let's also, in the meantime, we need help workers here immediately. What's wrong with a guest worker program like there have been in the past, which were thrown away because they had other issues with them? But the concept is good to me to do both.
Yeah, and
I'm
I
all
think-
for citizenship.
And I think, as immigration reform legislation moves through, these are exactly the kinds of things that have been in the past negotiated in the 2013 legislation and before that. And I do believe that with sound legislation, we would be able to both meet the needs of the labor force and also ensure that people can get on a pathway to citizenship after they've put in some time doing that.
I would like to, I think that the conversation around immigrants and their worthiness or their pathway to citizenship papers based on, whether they're able to contribute labor. I understand that there are people indeed that want to come to the United States to work, but there are hundreds of thousands of others that is not necessarily why they're coming. And I don't think that's also a good metric to base our policies on, like how much can they contribute, because it's not how much money can they give to our country, but based on their people. And you're right, a lot of people are coming from the Northern Triangle or from Central America. And if you look at history, right, I think it's ahistorical to think that they're coming based off of that we don't have anything to do with it. A lot of it has to do with U.S. imperialism in their countries. And a lot of them right now are waiting in Matamoros or waiting in
Talking about
Ciudad
the asylum
Juarez.
process.
Yes, or are waiting in Matamoros or in Ciudad Juarez, all across the border. And these are individuals who are asylum seekers. And because of the Remain in Mexico policies, they're waiting there. And it's become asylum as we know it in the United States, or as the president has said in the past decades, has completely been dismantled. There is just no way right now for us to confidently look at someone and say, yes, if you follow this process, these steps, then you're going to be able to apply for asylum. I've been working with a group right now of lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and trans people who are from Cuba and different countries in Central America. And they've been waiting there for months. And because of the so-called migrant protection protocols and Remain in Mexico, they crossed, they were in CBP custody for a couple of days, and they were sent right back. And every single day, they're terrorized by homophobia, by trans misogyny, by extortion. They have to bathe in the river. They're living in tents. And we've tried to get some of these folks out of the Remain in Mexico program. I was attorneys, advocates, community members. We walked with the group across the bridge, and we presented in front of CBP, and we said, according to MPP's own policy, the Remain in Mexico, there's supposed to be certain exemptions, which is terrible because the program is bad for everybody, but there's certain exceptions. So we walked with the group across, and CBP took them in, Chief Castillo took them into his custody, and then a couple of days later, he sent them right back. And he said that, he sent them back with a little piece of paper that said, we interviewed you, but you didn't show enough claim that you're afraid to be in Mexico. And I want to know, how is being extorted, having guns pointed to your face, being punched in the face for being a lesbian, being told that they're going to kill you because you're a trans woman, how is that not enough for CBP to cross over and to know that MPP is bad and to exempt people from it?
So how would you change the asylum system as it is now?
Well, immediately I would issue an executive order ending the Migrant Protection Protocol or Remain in Mexico policy. Donnie is right. I mean, there was just an Express News article yesterday, San Antonio Express News, the local newspaper here, chronicling that migrants who, in this case, were in Nuevo Laredo, have been subject to kidnappings, to extortion, beatings. It's very easy to believe, even more so if they're part of the LGBTQ community, and they are not granted an exemption which is supposed to exist under the policy so that they can actually come back and stay in the United States. It's a disaster of a policy. It flies in the face of the way that the United States has honored asylum claims in the past, and I would actually go back to how we used to do this, which was more effective.
Was it more effective, though, because still people were waiting for years to see a judge in court? There are many stories of people simply, finding the system too cumbersome, not being able to find the lawyer to represent them. I mean, it is an imperfect system.
Well, it was more effective than what we have now, but it does have to be improved. And one of the ways that we can improve it is to improve our immigration court system so that they have the resources to actually go through these claims, and that we change some of the policy that this administration has changed. For instance, if somebody has been the victim of domestic violence or gang violence, that does count toward making an asylum claim. There are ways that we can improve it, but the first thing we got to do is end this Remain in Mexico policy that is subjecting people who are already desperate to beatings and extortion, and to these drug cartels that are kidnapping them and then getting money from their relatives in Central America.
Secretary Castro, I have to ask you this because the migrants themselves, they see the news and they see what's happening. And they saw that in July, Cory Booker visited El Paso and walked 10 of them across the bridge. And they saw that. And when I see them every day, they ask me, who can come and help us? Can you come to Brownsville? Can you come to Matamoros and help them?
No, thank you for the question. I've had the opportunity now to go to the Ursula Processing Center in McAllen, to visit Homestead, to visit Tornillo, and one of the other facilities. We've been trying during this campaign to lift up and to spotlight the experience of migrants, especially the children. And so we'd be glad to see how we can be helpful in doing that, sure.
We're going to move to climate change now, and Alston Beinhorn. What would you like to know from Secretary Castro?
Well, climate change is not probably an immediate issue for a lot of people, apparently. But in my business,
Although that's changing.
Glad to hear it. In my business, being outdoors, raising livestock, what I've observed just in the last summer and the summer before that, most recently, is that it's unsustainable. The temperatures that have risen to in South Texas, near Laredo. When I first started doing this in the mid-'70s, I think in August of 1976, there was one day when the temperature was above 100 degrees. Just this past August 2019, there was one day when it wasn't above 100 degrees, and most of the days were 105 to 108 degrees. Anyway, the point is that this is unsustainable for livestock, for horses, for chickens, even for people working outdoors. And I think a lot of people who don't work outdoors maybe don't realize that as much. And it's here now. So my question is, to you really is how this is not an easy issue, because it involves taking some short-term economic pain, right, and some policies that are restrictive in terms of what people can do and should do with the environment, including probably cattle, which are part of the methane problem. How you as a presidential candidate, if you were to get the nominee, enlist the support of voters to change their minds, to do something immediately that's not really in their interest?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing up this issue, Austin, and especially from your perspective, which we don't hear enough, as somebody who's in the agriculture industry. But it's a powerful reminder that in so many different ways, we have an opportunity to confront this climate crisis. And I put out a plan a few weeks ago on how I would do that as president, beginning with the first day in office, recommitting to the Paris Climate Accord, and then setting a goal of getting to net zero carbon emissions in the United States by 2045, and leading so that at latest we can get there around the world by 2050. We would do that in many different ways, setting a clean energy standard, a clean transportation standard, incentivizing agriculture to adopt more environmentally friendly practices, putting in place a carbon fee, and a number of other steps that would help us get there. The good news is, when I get out there these days, whether it's in Iowa or here in Texas, especially among young people, there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and really resolve to do something about climate change. So I actually believe that we have a strong movement there to pressure the politicians in Washington, D.C., especially these folks that are representing swing congressional districts and swing states. A good example is Colorado. You have a Colorado Senator, Cory Gardner, who has his reelection this year. I mean, people in Colorado, I mean, that's a state where they care in spades about climate change. So I feel like the next president will have a good base of support to actually do something. And then to address this challenge of, okay, well, are there sacrifices that we need to make? I actually believe that we can both do right by our planet and also unleash a clean energy revolution in terms of jobs. Like a couple of weeks ago, I was in Newton, Iowa, and Newton used to have a Maytag washing machine manufacturing facility, and then it closed. But today, there's a company called TPI that manufactures wind turbines. And I visited TPI. They're employing several hundred people, paying decent wages, and they're part of this clean energy revolution.
But even with a lot of the changes that we're seeing in solar and wind, it cannot in the short term make up for the traditional sources of energy. And I'm wondering if you see a move to nuclear, for example. Are there other places where we should be looking for our energy that might not be coal and oil and gas?
Well, absolutely. We need to move away from coal, oil, and gas and phase out nuclear. Nuclear is definitely preferable when it comes to carbon emissions versus those other three. And the way that I think about it is sort of this worst first approach, working on immediately getting the worst of the types of energy that produces carbon emissions out first. I have set a goal in my plan of getting us to an electricity sector that is clean, renewable, and zero emissions by 2035. And, nuclear has a role in that, but I don't think that it has the primary role. I think ultimately renewables will have the primary role. And in Texas last month, for the first time ever, more energy was generated in Texas from wind than from coal. So this is already happening, and we do need improvements in things like battery storage for wind and solar. And so, yes, we're not completely there yet, but we're moving there very rapidly.
Secretary Castro has signed on to the Green New Deal. Where are you on that? I mean, how do you think it will help you as a business owner and a rancher?
I have no issue with the Green New Deal. I think it's pretty general, and it's not binding. And I think it's a path to work toward. But I think. You're talking about any particular points of it or not?
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering what you're hearing from Secretary Castro, and is this something that you think will help you and your concerns?
Sure, yeah, and I think what would really help me, if you were the Democratic, nominee, I think when you just go back in history and look at our most successful, best presidents, you go back to Lincoln maybe, or Teddy Roosevelt, or Wilson, or FDR, or maybe even Reagan. They had the ability to inspire people to do things that maybe they didn't really want to do because it was good for America. And we have that ethic in America that we have to find it sometimes. It's there somewhere down deep in us, but we need to have it brought out of us. How would you, as the Democratic nominee, bring that out of people? I guess what I'm talking about is appealing to their better angels. If you know what I mean.
No, I think you're right. It's become harder. Over the years to appeal to this common sense of national purpose and going in the same direction. And but I believe that we can do it. And climate change and immigration are both good opportunities to do that, where people can see a value for all of us as we tackle the climate crisis in creating jobs and opportunity for millions of people in a clean energy economy, putting people to work so they can provide for their families. When it comes to immigration, feeling better as a nation morally about how we're treating human beings, and then also recognizing, as I laid out, for instance, with the case for Social Security, that all of us can win if we harness the potential of immigrants. I think we can find these commonalities in these issues and seek to bring people together and inspire people around positive change.
I just have a quick question on something that binds immigration and climate change together, which is, in your platform, you say you'd like to create a specific category for climate refugees, for asylum seekers. That potentially could be hundreds of millions of people that will be globally affected by climate change at a time when the United States will also be dealing with internal displacement due to climate change, according to scientists' predictions. That seems to me like a big step. You're saying that the United States should open its doors potentially to hundreds of millions of people displaced by climate change?
Well, not hundreds of millions of people, that the United States should be a partner among allies to take in some refugees who have been displaced by climate change. And it's true that the United Nations has estimated that by 2050, up to 200 million people may be displaced around the world because of climate change. Of course, the United States is not going to take in 200 million people, but I believe that we need to step up and take some of them in. Right now, to give people a sense of scale, we're taking in less than 30,000 people, refugees, annually. At the height of the Obama administration, that was about 110,000 people annually. So I believe that we should increase that, and we can do that. And harness the great ability of refugees to help breathe new life into a lot of American communities out there, small towns that I've been to in different states, or add to the life of big cities. We can do this without, I think, only positively, without in any way jeopardizing the United States. We always have to measure how many people it is that we can take in, but we should take in. I think we have I believe, as I see it, we have an obligation to play our part to take in some climate refugees, and my plan spells that out.
I think
Just briefly,
taking in refugees is a great idea, but I think also importantly is how would you, as president, deal with foreign, other countries who are maybe part of the problem? To be blunt about it. I mean, when I lived and worked in Singapore for many years, right now Singapore is the air quality in Singapore, because of the fires in Indonesia, is, people in Singapore can't go out and of their houses some days because it's so bad. Look at Brazil. I mean, how would you as president deal with our allies and other countries who they want to get their fair share of economic development too? We've done it in the U.S. 100, 200 years ago. Europe did it 300 or 400 years ago.
America can't do it alone, so...
Well, that's right, and that's why it's so important that we're part of the Paris Climate Accord, and that we're leading on that. I mean, you're correct that there are countries, whether it's big countries like China or smaller countries, that say, hey, what are y'all talking about?
Yeah.
You had the opportunity to develop using coal and building your economy on that.
Chop
and now,
down your forests.
Yeah, now we're just coming up. And so, of course, the Paris Climate Accord does recognize that as well, right? There are differential standards for different countries. But they're even less likely to listen to anything we say if we're not even part of that agreement. So the first thing that we need to do is get back into that and then lead around the world to marshal support for, I believe, even stronger guidelines for the United States and for other countries.
Lead by example.
We need to begin by leading by example and do what we can also to help to supply them with the necessary tools that they need and equipment that they need to make that conversion. I would like to see companies like TPI, American companies that are manufacturing wind turbines or doing solar panels or something else that could be useful as China and India and others convert to renewable energy. I want them selling their products over there.
Secretary
We're
Castro.
going to have to, I'm so sorry, we're going to have to move to some pertinent questions about the situation right now in Washington. Obviously, impeachment is the word of the day. There's an inquiry going on. You came out very early in support of that inquiry. My question for you is, we know that Vice President Biden and the allegations against his son Hunter have been reviewed and investigated and found to be not substantive. However, there are questions about whether or not the actions of Hunter Biden and, by extension, the president were, not to use another word, swampy. That perhaps his son was trading on the currency of his father. Do you think that needs to be looked into?
I believe that Trump is trying to do to Joe Biden what he did to Hillary Clinton, that he's trying to take a public servant that has served honorably over the years and muddy their reputation with false accusations that in this case have been investigated. Throughout my time in public service, when I was in public service, city council, mayor at HUD, I always tried to uphold the highest ethical standard. I would do that as president. But to me, there are plenty of reasons for people to make a decision in this primary. I hope that in this Democratic primary, they're going to do that about the issues. I disagree with Vice President Biden on immigration, on health care, as people saw at the last debate, and a number of other issues. But I believe that he's fundamentally an honest and honorable man.
Do you think, though, he might be fatally flawed now because this has become the central narrative? I mean, he, by extension of this investigation in Washington, is part of that discussion. Do you think he can remain the front runner with this controversy surrounding him?
I'm going to avoid political punditry.
Oh, please.
Yeah, I'll skip the political punditry. Yeah.
I mean, but it's something. It's obviously something you're going to have to think about because you're running against him. So I'm wondering how you see it playing out.
I hope that he and others, are not successful because I am. Not because Donald Trump tries to get into the middle of the race and besmirch people's reputations. What I see is just a replay. This is the same playbook that Trump used in 2016. Create this image of a dirty politician that's part of a global elite. That's what he tried to do to Hillary Clinton. They smeared her all over Facebook and social media. You had people that I constantly saw posts all the time that had these fantastical notions about what she had done that were completely untrue. And that's what they're trying to do to Joe Biden. And so I'm going to focus on the disagreements that I have with whether it's Biden or other Democratic candidates on the issues. And my hope is that the American people are going to see the playbook that Trump has engaged in for what it is.
The most recent poll in Nevada showed not good news for you. You did not have great numbers, in fact, close to 0%. It's a state with a lot of Latinos. That's got to have hurt to see that you didn't do as well as you may have hoped.
I think there haven't been that many polls of Nevada. That's been the problem, one of the problems. As opposed to the other three early states, Nevada has gotten very little attention.
But is it sending a signal to you that perhaps it might be time to move on to something else?
Not at all. Not at all. We have 4 months until Iowa votes and 4.5 months until Nevada caucuses. And so we're going to keep working hard in this campaign.
I'll ask you a question that obviously is asked to Beto O'Rourke and others who are running in states with Senate seats up for grabs for the Democrats. Obviously, the Senate is enormously important. John Cornyn here of Texas is up for re-election. And many ask, why aren't you running for Senate? Why are you running for president?
Because my experience is actually as a federal executive. I'm one of the few people, I think maybe Joe Biden, who has actually served as a federal executive. The president is a federal executive.
Would you consider it, though?
No, I'm not going to run for Senate.
Under any circumstances?
I will not run for Senate. And the good news is that we have talented women and men who have stepped up, several of whom, if they're the Democratic nominee, stand a good chance of beating John Cornyn. And so, they're in that race, and I applaud them for doing it. In 2014, people wondered whether I was going to run for governor of Texas, and I said that I wasn't, and I didn't. In 2018, they thought I might run for governor, and I said I wasn't, and I didn't. I'm telling folks I'm not going to run for senator, and I'm not.
You are also voted the man most likely to be vice president by some, if indeed you don't get the nomination. Is that something that you would consider? I'm not interviewing for other jobs, but it is important for people to know.
So, I'm running for president, and I already went once through the vice presidential process, and it wasn't my favorite process because the vice presidential process is unlike any other thing in American politics. Basically, it's about one person's decision. What I've always enjoyed about public service and politics is that you get to go out with the people and to talk to the people and try and convince the people. You know, convincing one person and a few advisors is not what I do. So I'm running for president.
One last question on impeachment. Do you think it's the best thing for the country if indeed the House votes to impeach and if indeed there is a trial in the Senate? Do you think that that is really the best thing for the country in a year which will see an election?
Well, I believe the best thing for the country would be not only impeachment, but removal. This president has violated his oath of office. He has abused his power. People can read that in that transcript. In unprecedented ways, he has used the office of the presidency to boost himself and put his own self-interest above the national interest. How much more evidence do people need that this man should not be anywhere near the Oval Office? And I don't care if you're a Republican. If you're a Republican, go find somebody that's actually decent and honest and honorable. Fine, and has a different point of view from Democrats. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with, and I've had a problem with when I was a city councilman, and I saw two people taken out of City Hall in handcuffs, or when I was mayor or HUD secretary, and we dealt with all types of fraud at housing authorities across the United States. What I have a problem with is politicians who are dishonest, who are using that office for their own personal gain and are not there for the right reasons. You need to get rid of people like that, whether they're, some politician on the school board, at City Hall, a state legislature, or even in the Oval Office. Get rid of that guy.
All right, thank you so much, Secretary Castro, and thank you so much to our voters, Alston Beinhorn, and of course, Nani Marrero-He. Thank you both very much.
You're welcome.
This is Off Script from NPR. I'm Lulu Garcia-Navarro.
Great job.
Thank you.
But yeah, we'd love to follow up with you.
Please.